Good morning, everyone. We're going to give it a couple of minutes to let everybody join. Okay, well, we'll start with some housekeeping matters. So, good morning, and thank you for joining us. This is our first webinar in our Charging Ahead series, where we cover the most salient, pressing issues for the industry overall, usually by combining it with a case study of recent work that we've completed. So we thought we'd kick off the series by speaking to one of the most pressing challenges for the sector in the country, and I guess the world at large, which is CO2 pathways modeling, which really enables policymakers to get a handle on what emissions look like, where it's coming from, how much it costs to abate, and then they can make appropriate decisions about the timelines for that abatement. My name's Ezra Beeman. I'm Managing Director of Energea. We are a specialist consultancy based in Davis, California, and Sydney, Australia. So before we get into the actual content today, a few housekeeping matters. We will do Q&A at the end. You're welcome to put any questions you have about the content into the chat along the way. Sarah's going to help me curate that, and we'll do our best to answer it at the end of the session. The other thing to note is that there is going to be a poll where we offer up a couple of potential topics and we get feedback from the audience. So you please don't forget to vote before you leave today. Now, moving on to the content. Today we're going to first talk about the CO2 targets and outlooks, looking at the U.S. as a whole and some of the key states that are taking a leadership position in their CO2 pathway setting and roadmaps. Then we'll talk about how the actual analysis and modeling of CO2 emissions is being done. We've got some results from recent work where we looked at the various models that are out there, how they're together, and then we'll finish with key recommendations. So let's start with the U.S. commitment to CO2 reductions effort with the Paris Agreement. That's looking to keep warming at 2 degrees C or lower. And as part of that agreement, each jurisdiction that signs up has to quantify their emissions and how they're going to get to the target goals by 2050 relative to 2005 base level. So the U.S. is committed to a 50 to 52% reduction. We do note that modeling completed by the UN has found it not to actually hit the 2-degree target. I don't think there's a lot of teeth in the regulations, but to the degree that the U.S. Continues its commitment, then there's probably a risk that these targets become more stringent. And it's interesting in looking across the states that have committed to pathways, and there are only a handful at the moment. You compare this with, for example, Australia, which is vacillated between their commitment as well, given how much coal and natural gas they have as national resources. But even those states, of which there are much fewer, are starting to come on board, and you're seeing targets for net zero emissions by 2040 even. So it will be interesting to see how the U.S. Commitments play out. Now, turning to the states and their commit. Well, sorry, actually, before I go on, if you look at the U.S. baseline scenario, which is shown here, you can see where the emissions are currently coming from, and what they're expected to do over the period of 2050 under a sort of a do-nothing scenario. And you can see what has been comprising those emissions in terms of transport, industrial, residential, and commercial. And you see across the US that transport is the #1 source of emissions, followed by industrial, which was a little bit of a surprise to me, but that's across the country. And then the bottom right slide, you can actually see that broken out by the actual fuel source. So again, transport and petroleum is the #1 source across the country. So let's turn then to what the states themselves are doing. Now, I think, like I said, there's only a handful of states with mandates to get to net zero, somewhere around 10, so about one-fifth, right? Non-Excel assisted math. And the leaders that we've identified here, really, they've been chosen because they have quite clear roadmaps as to how they're going to get to their chosen target. You notice that the US target in the dotted line gets us there by 2050, but not all states are following that pathway. We've got some, even among the leadership, that are slightly higher or lower. And so if you look there, what you'll see is that at the moment, Maryland and California have the most stringent targets at trying to achieve net zero by 2045. And then if you look at the bottom left slide, where we take the total emissions and we divide it by population, so it's a per capita number, it does a couple of things. One is it allows you to compare relatively large states like California with smaller states like Maryland, and in terms of the challenges ahead on a relative basis. And that does a couple of things. One, you can see states like Colorado, which have a 2050 target, having a fair bit more carbon to abate per capita than, say, Maryland, California, or Massachusetts. But pretty much the other thing I would call out is just the power system has got relatively more carbon in it than some of the other power systems that you can see here. But across the board, transport is reflective of the national trend as being by far the largest source of emissions that need to be abated to hit net zero targets. And they're followed by either the power system or the building system. And to the degree that a lot of this energy gets moved onto the electric system, you can just imagine that transport being moved into the electric power system and growing those emissions if nothing were done. So you really had to tackle most of these emissions. You need a combination of building, transport, power system, and then you, and in some cases like Delaware, you can see that they actually have quite a bit of industrial load, which has shown to be the hardest sector to abate. Although a lot of that we think is changing by virtue of the investments being made in Europe and places like Australia to find solutions for the industrial carbon emissions. So doing a little bit of a deep dive on Colorado, and this is really more a reflection of the ease of access of their information. You can see they've got a couple of scenarios about their what they expect to emit over time if nothing's done. They've got a 2019 action, which continues the trend, but the HB 1261 targets is the real line that's going to see them get to close to net zero by 2050. If you then dig into where the emissions are coming from on a sector-wide basis, you can see it's energy end use. They've got relatively less emissions coming out of industrial processes, land use, et cetera. And then if you look at it in terms of the actual sectors themselves, you can see, again, electric power, transportation, and residential, commercial, and industrial fuel use. So this can be building emissions. So really the key question for a state like Colorado or any of the other states is, given this is the least cost method for achieving them, and does that change over time, and how can those targets be enabled? Under the Paris Accord, which doesn't apply to the states, there is a requirement that every 5 years you review your pathways analysis, and where it is cost effective or lower cost to do so, that the targets get raised. And that's a trend that we've seen in other jurisdictions, and we would expect to continue just as the industry learning curve brings down costs, it becomes cheaper to abate CO2, and the targets can be accelerated. We saw something similar in renewable energy, for example. So let's talk about how this is being done. Now, I was a bit surprised. We were engaged in a project in California to support a community choice aggregator in identifying what is best practice in CO2 pathways modeling. And we were only able to find, in addition to our own, 4 other pathways analyses that had been done across the country. One of them we didn't include here because it was just so hard to get information about that study. But other studies you can see, E3 did a study for California in 2018. Evolved Energy Research did it on behalf of the United States, called Energy Pathways. ICF did one in 2021 for New York City. And then we have our own there called CSIM for Carbon Simulator. Now, you see a lot of commonality. I mean, you've got standard protocols for reporting your emissions. And so covering buildings, covering electricity generation, covering natural gas, transport and waste, that tends to be the lion's share, 90-95%, depending on the jurisdiction, of sources of emissions. And there's not, I mean, all these models pretty much do this. I think the only thing that we saw in this analysis was a lack of analyses of military emissions, mostly because it's really hard to get. And then on the waste side, just how much of the total waste streams were covered by the pathway solutions. And for example, the power system, because you can process some of that waste into waste to energy projects. So I think the biggest thing that we found was just on the actual pathways modeling. So to identify least cost policy making and just the cost of policy making, you have to have some way to apply potential carbon abatement solutions into the activity within each sector. Now, by far what we found, the most popular methods were to use stock and turnover models. All of the systems use those. So very detailed and granular. But what we found was there was a lot of top-down modeling of the technology adoption, where assumptions were made about what that adoption was, and it was put into a linear solver, and it spit out the answers. Now, our own approach and where we think we need to head is in more behavior-based modeling. So it's great to see what's least cost and to make assumptions that are top-down around what's going to happen. But is that realistic? And is that a focus on customer behavior, particularly in the early days of CO2 pathways development? Program development is really critical, because while you can regulate bans on appliances or bans on new construction, it tends to have consequences with respect to the labor pool, and also it tends to have a political pushback. So to the extent that carrots can be used, particularly in the earlier stages, to educate and to get buy-in, that's likely to be a more politically feasible and acceptable way to start on this journey. In order to do that, you need to have a focus on people's decision-making, how new appliances and vehicles are purchased, what it costs, and to think more with the consumer, the end customer in mind. The other key difference, they all do annual sort of outcomes, but being able to estimate the impact of CO2 policies at an hourly level, which is generally what matters for the electricity system, and also on a spatial basis, which also matters a lot for the electricity system, but also gas systems and logistics systems, is also important, and something that we expect to see in more of the modeling moving forward. So a comprehensive model is sort of just necessary from the start in terms of covering all the sectors. That it includes both policies and regulations to force things to happen, and importantly to have customer behavior considerations so that realistic timeframes can be set, and people can be encouraged to do the right thing, and not have it be a big financial impost. These are all important hallmarks of best practice. But the other one, and the only way that you can actually reduce carbon, is by considering abatement strategies. And so having a wide range of these abatement strategies is really important to ensuring that you identify the least cost approach. And you can see here across the electricity system, transport sectors, buildings, etc., there's a range of major strategies that we've seen in the research. And to the extent that you don't have one of these strategies and it's a low-cost strategy, or things change, and there's a risk that the least cost solution has not been identified. So if you're ever involved in one of these studies, just make sure that the abatement solutions are as comprehensive as possible and up to date. All right, so when we applied this to a jurisdiction in the US, it was pretty interesting, and we'll just sort of take you through what that looks like. So the first part of the modeling, building this bottom-up stock and turnover model, which stock and turnover model, for those that aren't familiar with them, just basically means that you have a database of potentially all the buildings, but certainly all of the appliances and equipment. Let's say in this case, the building sector, how many water heaters, how many space heaters, how many stoves and ovens are there. And you can start to generate from that model. The turnover part of it is how many are installed every year through new construction, through major remodels, and how many are replaced every year because they're end of life. And so that's what goes into this sort of modeling. And that can then define a cumulative CO2 supply curve. So this would basically say that if 100% of that turnover occurred, or stock and turnover occurred, this is how much CO2 you could save from this sector, from each of these end uses over time. Now, to calculate the cost of that savings, and ignoring customer behavior for the moment, you then calculate the difference in upfront costs and operating costs, and you can get $1 per megaton of CO2 equivalent per year, which is shown on the bottom left side. Now, if you pull all that together, the costs and the amount over time, and let's say this is a 20-year study, you can then get a supply cost curve for that sector, which we're showing here. In this case, in this jurisdiction, and this is heavily jurisdictionally specific. The costs, or the cost of the CO2 abatement, is going to be a function of relativities in gas appliance versus electric appliance, and also relativities in the cost of gas and the cost of electricity. And they can look very different jurisdictionally. So just take this as a case study and assume it could look very different where you operate. On the bottom right then is the result. Most of the CO2 in buildings in this particular jurisdiction were space heating. So it's a colder climate, and cooking, and in water heating, primarily because not a lot of gas was being used in water heating. It just didn't deliver. There's not a lot there to reduce. So very different sort of recommendation outcomes in this jurisdiction. Now, turning to transport, and we're just looking at 3 vehicle types here. In the work that we do, depends on the jurisdiction, but you can get 10 to 20, especially if you're using telematics data, and that brings in sort of duty cycles. But in this case, at a high level, you have passenger vehicles and how much cumulative CO2 could be abated in a perfect world. You have how much trucks are responsible, and that includes articulated as well as fixed, and then buses. And again, in this jurisdiction, the buses just do not represent nearly as much emissions as passenger vehicles and trucks. and fully fledged analyses, we would be including rail and marine and air transport emissions as well. Generally, they're not nearly as big as just road transport, though. We then turn that in $1 per megaton of CO2 equivalent savings per year. And that's basically the marginal cost. And then you can see here on the bottom right, and in this case, we're showing that converting to passenger vehicles in this particular market is a function of the upfront costs and ongoing differentials between electricity versus oil. It's actually cost effective in this particular jurisdiction for passenger vehicles to be converted. Trucks were line ball, and then buses were considerably more expensive. And this is something that we're seeing in other jurisdictions, mainly because buses don't necessarily travel that far. And so the trade-off between the upfront cost and the operating costs are different, and they're quite heavy. And so they require a lot of battery storage, which at the time that this was done was still relatively high. As the cost of lithium falls over the next 2 years by 50%, which is what we're seeing out there in the market, we expect this to look very, very different. And this is why it is so important to periodically update these studies. Paris requires every 5 years. With the dynamics in the market and the rate of the pace of change in technologies, doing it every 2 to 3 years, we think could result in a significantly different picture. Okay, so here's where we're just bringing together two sectors, in this case, building and transport. And depending on how much abatement the policy maker is looking for, you can sort of cut into wherever you like. But in this case, what immediately leaps to mind is that focus on converting the water heating, focus on converting passenger vehicles, focus on converting trucks, maybe leave space heating and cooking and buses a little bit later, push those costs out into the future. Again, it depends on what you're trying to achieve here. If it's really just taking off the table all the cost-effective items, which seems like a win-win proposition, then that's how you'd approach it. If you really needed to get 25 megatons of CO2 abated, then you're going to have to move into the space heating sector, or possibly cooking, because there's not a lot of difference in cooking can bring with it improvements to air quality within the home. So, but having this information in front of you can only lead to better decisions about where the focus should be, and then programs can be designed to address barriers to the adoption, which again then starts to focus on consumer behavior and how best to incorporate it. Okay. Now that's great that the industry or the whole country may be moving in the direction of electrification as a solution. It doesn't have to be any gas. That can be certified natural gas. But to the degree it is electricity, then the electricity sector also has to be abated, or you've just traded one source of emissions for another. And some work we did in California, again for a we were looking at 24/7 CO2. So net zero is great. You'll need some offsets. There'll be some potential trading of excess renewable energy, but ultimately, we expect most jurisdictions, as we get closer to 2045, 2050, we'll have to start looking at 24/7 uh, zero carbon solutions. And so this was a project where that was the case. We looked at the least cost portfolio, and you can see because there's a big increase in the amount of capacity, mostly in wind, and this is a function really of the relative costs and relative profiles. When we did this in Australia, for example, we did the same outcome because the wind profile was the offshore wind profile was not that much different than the onshore wind profile. And in this case, fuel cells came out as a lower cost solution. Again, depending on your inputs, you may have a different sort of outcome here. In addition to showing the portfolio mix, it shows the cost per megaton per year to achieve it. And again, you had to jump in 2030 to 2035, mainly because of the that was inflection point where CO2 emissions were pretty much close to zero. And you see from 2035 onward, the increase in capacity is closer to an organic growth trajectory. Okay, so key takeaways is that Paris is going to require periodic reviews of costs and raising of targets if costs fall. Given what we've seen over the past 5 years, we'd expect the cost to achieve zero carbon to continue to fall, possibly at an accelerating rate. The significant reduction in the cost of lithium is going to reduce the cost of batteries, reduce the cost of renewable energy, reduce the cost of electrified transport. And so we expect to feed through into the cost of CO2 abatement. We expect to see more states, particularly the vanguard, move from mandates around their power system to mandates across the wider economy. I think work like this is going to really help give people confidence that this can be done, and increasingly it can be done as a least cost option. I mean, I remember starting out in the energy industry where investments in solar were viewed in some quarters as just a tax on people who were bad at math, right? You had an asset with a 100-year payback that would only last years. Now, increasingly, solar in where the sun is shining and electricity. So as the focus turns to quantifying, tools are going to be really important, and it's important that the right part of that optimization, and it's important that these are done peer behavior and industry best practice, removing barriers and accelerating adoption of the technology and the solutions. So in terms of recommendations, we recommend setting up a CO2 pathways model. We expect to see that even at the municipal level, the costs have come down quite considerably for setting one of these up. Include the customer behavior as a key factor. Make sure that it's able to account for intersector impacts, for example, between a power system and building end use, that you're able to identify the key cost drivers and mitigation strategies to arrive at the least cost solution, and also particularly for gas and electricity, potentially where there might be gas decommissioning, spatial analysis is really important. And that all really needs to be factored into the design of the modeling solution. So thank you for your attention and for joining us today. If you're able to stick around for the Q&A, look forward to it, but we also understand if you've got other things to do today. All right. So we've got Q&A now. Please do vote for your favorite charging ahead virtual power plants, public charging infrastructure sizing, minimizing the cost of solar PV integration, establishing a resiliency backbone with microgrids, and best practice behind the meter forecasting as potential topics. Next time, we've already locked this in. We're going to focus on removing barriers to building electrification, again, using a case. So please sign up for that when you see the email. We will send a copy of this presentation in a follow-up email, and please do forward it to anyone you think may be interested. So let's turn to the Q&A. Okay, so the question is, our work finds that the cost benefit per megaton of CO2 for building electrification, which are at similar magnitude, are highly sensitive to relative prices of gas and electricity rates. How did you account for the ranges of rate forecasts? So in the work that we do, it really depends on the study. Obtaining gas price forecasts again is jurisdictionally specific. I mean, EIA does sort of 3-year forecasts, and a lot depends on the oil price. So these are all key inputs to the modeling, and I totally agree when the total cost of ownership is 50% or more in the operating costs and the fuel costs, including electricity. The thing to get right is the forecast you're using. Now, the way that we deal with these forecast variability issues is really scenario based analysis, feasible potential futures, and by having those internally consistent set of assumptions, you can cover the range of realistic outcomes. And to me, as a forecasting and a planning practitioner, scenario-based analysis is really going to be where they are, for example. Okay, so next, why is the cost of buses higher than trucks? So as I touched on during the presentation, it really is a function of the differential in upfront costs, and buses, although the costs are coming down, cost us significantly more. Electric buses cost significantly more than the natural gas fueled or diesel fueled buses. Hydrogen are even more expensive, offsetting that. A key difference between buses and trucks really is mileage. And so if you pay that premium in terms of CapEx or capital expenditure, and you do the miles, then the operating savings can make it more cost effective. And so when you take the total cost of ownership and you compare it between the two, trucks, at least in that jurisdiction, were line ball, almost cost effective in their own right compared to buses where they weren't able to pay for themselves. Now, technology like vehicle to grid could be a key contributor to bringing down the cost of buses. Because they're not driving around, they're sitting there, those assets could be used in a different way. So this is the sort of creative thinking that we're seeing across the world and across the industry, that over time we expect to help bring those costs down along with just a halving of the lithium price. Okay, so the question here: heat pump water heating is the best technology. Why not resistive? So it's resistive water heaters are pretty well understood. I mean, they're not used in very much in places like California because natural gas has been so cheap. But these devices are pretty basic, pretty simple, and they can last 20 years. And so they're relatively low cost. The key downside, particularly for a standard single family dwelling, is that you might be talking, especially on a storage system, about a 5 kilowatt heating element that water